I am Rasmus Paludan, journalist and editor of The Voice of Freedom, and I'm here today in Washington, D.C. with Steve Coughlin, a former U.S. intelligence officer who actually wrote some quite interesting memos when he was working for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So maybe you want to introduce yourself a little further?
It's a pleasure to be here. My name's Steve Coughlin, and I was somebody who worked in the intelligence directorate having to do with counterterrorism, and when I left that, I was brought back as a consultant because of my ability to generate information that aligned hostile activities with targets, and was quite successful at it. So successful that it got me in a lot of trouble.
Would you say that what you did was related to the religion of Islam and how that affects the national security of allied nations in NATO?
The way I would put that is I was asked to analyze the nature of the people we were fighting, and at the time it was Al-Qaeda and radical Islamic organizations, and what I did was I looked at what they said was the basis of their threat doctrine, and they said they fought according to Islamic law, and then I went and procured Islamic law and found out that they were accurately citing to the Quranic sources that Islam says are definitive, and without making broad comments on what Islam is or isn't. I was basically pushing the idea, or the evidentiary argument that here are the hadiths they quote. The hadiths say that. Here's the argument they're making in furtherance of violence. They're actually using classical arguments for it, so that you cannot make the argument that they have misinterpreted Islam, and you cannot make the argument that they even have a secondary or third level understanding of Islam, that they're accurate as stated. And if you don't want to agree with me, you can go 5 miles down the road to the Islamic bookstore and get these books yourself.
Would you say that the current theory of the big replacement in Europe is a conspiracy or something that has some merit?
Well, I think that there is clearly things going on where national leaders all over the West are making a decision to suppress national identity, and one of the things they're doing is bringing in large populations to challenge that identity. I was just reading the Tony Blair Institute report that came out 2 weeks ago, where they made a point of going prosecuting hate speech, and the hate speech was literally discussed in this way. When a major terrorist event happens, which they have to admit came from a Muslim terrorist organization or an Islamic attack happens, the hate crime that they're going to crack down on will be people saying, hey, these Muslims engaged in terrorist attacks, and then prosecute them, so that the people who are the object of the attack become prosecuted at a higher rate with more intensity than the actual terrorist attack itself. So I would call that, we look at the whole concept of this hate crime, and I would put that and link that with the immigration issue, is hate crimes are people actually commenting factually on the fact that they're being suppressed for identifying themselves. What's wrong with a Danish person asserting his Danish identity in Denmark? I mean, and yet that's clearly what the goal is, and these populations are being brought in specifically to say that, well, they have to feel like they belong here, and therefore you have to shut up. And I'll go back to the Tony Blair report.
So, for instance, in Denmark, this Turkish male nurse who is quite outspoken in the media, public debate, and so forth, and he's made this statement more or less precisely to every Danish person, I guess. You just have to accept when you go to hospital that you may very well be treated by a Muslim female wearing a hijab. If you have a problem with that, you should just leave Denmark and never come back. So is this the kind of aggressive hate that is invoked upon the natural populations of Europe by the Muslims arriving there?
You know, I struggle with that question, because if they're making that assertion, they're being allowed to make that assertion. And they're being allowed to make that assertion because at the end of the day, what's happening is the Danes are being told, and it's being enforced through state action, that they have to lower national standards. And the simple fact of the matter is, those hospital standards were created by people who are interested in enriching medical sciences and in sanitation. And so this acceptance of this practice is actually a devolving of practices which were understood to be professional, which were trained to that level because that's the standard.
Yeah, but now the new thing is that when you arrive and you have certain standards in civilized Western countries, then it's like, well, if you hold those standards, then you're demeaning us as Muslims, so you need to get out of your own country because now otherwise you're hateful towards us and that's not allowed.
Yes, that's exactly what's happening. You know, there's the saying that's as old as the Roman Empire, that when you're in Rome, you do what the Romans do. And at some point, you know, you can visit a country, you can stay for a while, and of course there are a lot of international businesses that have people go back and forth. Well, we're not talking about that. But if you make a decision that you want to go move to a foreign country, you're making a decision to swap out your values and national values as national identity and to become the citizen of a new country.
Yeah, but I have to ask, is this at all realistic? Because I usually use the example. If I move with a friend, a female friend and a male friend, so we're three of us, and we move to Afghanistan, you know, the practice there is, if you're a male, then you tend to sodomize 13 and 14-year-old boys. That's part of the culture. And if you're a female, you wear the burqa. And I'm just saying, I don't see that happening, that we're the three of us from Denmark, the two guys are going to sodomize 13-year-old boys and the female is going to wear the burqa. I don't see us adapting to that. So is it realistic to expect that Afghanis coming to Denmark would have first of all, the willpower, but also the ability to throw away everything they've learned their entire life in Afghanistan and say, well, this is Denmark, we love those new values, screw everything we've learned our entire lives?
Well, I would say that would be why once you're in Afghanistan and realize that's going on and you have to make that type of decision, you may decide that, you know what, this is not for me, and leave. And the Afghans will say, it was nice to see you, and there you had your life event that over a period of time you'll filter out. I go back to the idea that if that's happening in Denmark, it's because powers to be are allowing it to happen because they want it to happen. And therefore, the question I'm struggling with right now is, I can argue every question you have on the Islamic side, Islamic movement side, or I could argue it on, and I could do that pure when we're in the AOR, in the Middle East, okay? It happens that, you know, there are quite a number of Muslims who are actually quite offended that Islam in the world is being defined by people who want to go back to the 7th century. I'm not, you know, carrying anybody's water, but I think at the same time, you have to look and say, but they're in your country, and who is? It's not a Muslim court that's prosecuting Danish citizens for standing up. It's a government court. It's a government court that's run by Danes. And there you have it. You go back to the document that was seized in an FBI raid in 1991 called the Explanatory Memorandum, that was admitted into a federal court of law to the largest prosecution on funding and support of terrorism, where that document said that we are going to destroy your civilization by your hands. We are not going to dirty our hands with your law, except to get into it and get people in your world to do our business and shut you down.
So for instance, in Denmark, when many Danish citizens, ethnic Danes, are being prosecuted and sent to prison for hate speech against Muslims, which is basically telling truth about Islam, that's an example of Islam and Muslims using Western countries' governments to fight the citizens there.
Absolutely, that's true. Absolutely, that's true. However, it's also true they were brought in for that purpose, and that's kind of where I'm doing.
And who brought them in? The government?
Well, I don't live in Denmark, so I can't get into the specific facts of it. But I mean, I find myself interested looking at the founders of the European Union and some of the things they were saying back as far as the 1920s. I'd have to look at the guy's name to pronounce it right. An Austrian in the 1920s talking about population replacement. and he's considered an icon of one of the founding fathers of the European Union. And I take a look at the headquarter building in Belgium. It's named after a Spanish Marxist.
Okay.
And you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I understand completely. I
saying,
think our viewers understand as well, because it's not like it's a complete surprise that there is a link between socialists and communists, which is what they are, even though they may call themselves progressive or liberal, depending on where you are in the world, and Islam and the taking over of the West by invasion, by the Great Replacement. This is something we know. I spoke with Trevor Loudon about this in December of 18, so our viewers have seen this already. But
it is in Islamic parlance called hijra.
Hijra.
And hijra has the nominal meaning of just going somewhere, but in a jihadi sense, a hijra is flooding the zone, and then raising it up. And you know what? That conforms perfectly to Maoist models that establish what are called mass line movements.
Okay, so we know there's this cooperation. We know that there's a great replacement taking place in Europe by a massive amount of people coming in, and those people being married and having children very early in life, and having a lot of them compared to the aging population of Europe. Danes have 1.8 children, they have them very late in life. Muslims in Denmark have like 7.2 children, they have them very early in life. This is mathematics. Is this just more or less based on the fact that Muslim countries are very poor and very unsafe and bad, so naturally as a Muslim you would seek towards Europe? Or is there some kind of plan? Are there some people planning this and doing this?
I won't rule out the fact that maybe in the 50s and 60s and in that period you had people immigrating, but as a practical matter they were immigrating and more or less integrating into the society. I think when you get into the 90s and to today, there is political movement behind them. And it's not the same, but there's a similarity to the UN funding large movement of people up through Mexico to the US border. And you're being told that this is just a spontaneous movement of people, where in fact you have video of police, the police helping them get to the border, being supported by international organizations. And even the Pope donated $500,000 to this movement. And you start to realize this is part of a movement. And if I could say, hate speech narrative is where I'm going to throw a tricky term at you. It's one that comes from the legal world. It's called facially neutral language. Are you familiar with that?
No.
Facially neutral language is you say you want something very harsh, but you say it in very neutralized language, and you say it monotone. So people will go right by it and read it, and they'll just go to the next point. And you have to say, oh, did you read that closely? Did you read that closely? And I'm going to give you an example. The Organization for Islamic Cooperation, which is at the leadership level, it's run by the heads of states of every Islamic country. Okay.
51 Islamic countries.
57.
57 even.
57. There's a joke in the United States about that, because there was a certain person running for president that said he visited all 57 states. Okay. Okay. So that's kind of you get a joke out of that. But in their most recent documents, they basically are claiming in facially neutral language that they're claiming jurisdiction over Muslims in non-Muslim countries. And lo and behold, you have groups like the Muslim Brotherhood in non-Muslim countries asserting that control. Now, what becomes interesting is you take the language of the Islamic movement, and you take the language of the hard left, and they converge at the hate speech narrative. The hate speech narrative is interoperable between the Islamic and the hard left, so that the one can pulse and the other will join in. I don't know if that's... So you should be looking at the main advance attack on you as a narrative-driven attack.
What is the Muslim Brotherhood?
The Muslim Brotherhood is an organization that was founded by Hassan al-Banna in the 1920s out of Egypt, and their goal is to reestablish Islamic law and reestablish the caliphate. Their motto is, Islam is our, I can't remember their full motto, but there's a way that they're characterized in the West as nonviolent. We can work with them, and then they position themselves as the moderate alternative to radical Al-Qaeda, the moderate alternative to radical ISIS. But in the way they operate, we in the West created an analytical model that says there's the moderate and there's the extremist. But that completely overwrites how these movements operate. Actually, the main element is the nonviolent actor, the Muslim Brotherhood. And they need groups like Al-Qaeda to be violent so they can come to you and say, we can stop them if you work with us. And what happens is you work with them and they say, well, what do we have to do? And they say, well, you have to do exactly what they said. That's the whole movement. And there's a concept of political warfare that makes that happen. And it's very interesting that the number one way we analyze terrorism completely destroys that ability to make those connections.
I have to say that there's a micro comparison here that makes a lot of sense to me, so I'm just going to run it by you. I'm also the leader of the Hardline Party in Denmark, and we've been doing a lot of protests in predominantly Muslim areas where we've done things with the Quran. For instance, we played a sport called Five Quran, which consists of 5 people throwing the Quran towards one another and handling it. And there is something I call the Sharia patrol, which is basically elderly Muslim males. And then they show up and then they try to get the younger Muslim males to stay away from us because the younger Muslim males are very, very violent and they want to come and beat us. Of course, there's police there, so that rarely happens, although sometimes it does happen. This is kind of on a micro scale, more or less what you said, because the young Muslim males, they're the terrorists, the corresponding to the terrorists. They're like the Al-Qaeda in this microcosm, and the elderly Muslim males that are trying to keep them away, they're the Muslim Brotherhood, and eventually they're going to say the same thing. Yeah, we kept them away today, but if you really want them to stop doing this, you'll have to do what they want, which is not offend Islam and show them respect and bow towards them and so forth. Do you think that comparison makes sense?
I think it makes a lot of sense, but I also think there's one additional point. They're not doing that for your benefit. They're doing that so when they go to your national leaders, they can say, see, we are really trying to maintain a buffer. But at a certain point, and you're working with us, so we're really helping you, okay, that at some point, nature has to take its course. And at which point they're going to be convinced, your national leaders, well, gosh, it's a terrible thing that happened, but you know what? They deserved it. And you know what's interesting about that? It happens to be a perfect parallel with what's happening with, at least in the United States and at least in some European countries, where you have socialist, crypto neo-Marxist governments saying peaceful things, but their narrative is exactly the same as Antifa. And you know what else is funny? Is that you're starting to see groups like Antifa kind of coordinating with groups like ISIS. And all of a sudden we have to realize that just like they're doing at the violent level, isn't it something that those socialist neo-Marxist governments are also having a nice discussion with the Islamic movement groups like the Brotherhood?
I can tell you about the riots in Copenhagen on the 14th of April. I managed to throw the Quran twice, or as we call it in Denmark, the big whore book, or Mohammed's pedophile guidebook. I managed to throw it twice, and then Muslims came running, and I and my cameraman, we were evacuated and so forth. Then that neighborhood in Copenhagen was set on fire, and there were massive riots. And the two predominant groups in those riots, of course, there's always the usual criminals who'll come to the street when there's a riot and they'll play along, but there were two groups. There were the extreme leftists, that's the Antifa you just mentioned, and then there were the young Muslims. Those were the two groups. So it's not just, as far as I can tell, it's not just a theory. We've seen that happening in reality in Copenhagen on the 14th of April. The extreme leftists, the Antifa, rioting and burning the city down with the young Muslims.
Well, the only thing I would disagree with you on is that it's not a theory. I mean, I think what is a theory is how things are being explained to the population. And it's a theoretical model, and then they basically then disqualify you for having an opinion because you don't have the appropriate master's degree on it. So you're being deprived of language to say, here's what I see, here's what it is, that's what happened. Oh, it's more complicated than that. Oh, it's complicated. You've heard people say that? It's complicated?
Well, absolutely.
Well, you should know the whole it's complicated is a narrative. It's a structured narrative. And what's the structured narrative designed to do? To say that no matter what it is we're talking about, it's too complicated for you. Oh, it works on many levels.
Okay, but in reality, one could propose, I'm going to propose this, you can comment, it's not very complicated. We have a religion called Islam, and there's a bound set of rules that dictates that religion and its followers. And the Hijra is one of those rules. That's taking over places and enforcing that religion upon the people there. That's why in Egypt there are no longer any Christians, more or less. There are a few Copts, but otherwise they're all Muslim there. No Jews either. So that's what's happening in Europe for the most part, and that's not very complicated, is it?
Well, I would say that the large movement you're seeing isn't coming from the entire Muslim world. I think it's coming from a couple key strategic groups. I would put Turkey in there, the Persian Gulf states. Iran is active, but they're not active in this kind of thing, and Pakistan. But I don't know, I mean, that, for example, Egypt is all that interested in seeing large migrations of people go there. They recently overthrew Morsi to establish order. And
when you say Persian states, that's
Persian Gulf states.
Persian Gulf state. That's the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia,
and Qatar.
And Qatar.
Yeah.
Those would be the three countries that are funding this together with Turkey, or doing it.
I think it's fair to say that the large part of the funding comes from, or support comes from countries like Qatar and Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, okay. And Pakistan for their own reasons, but I mean the same reasons as everybody else, religion, right? We want the religion as well. If you're a Muslim, you want that.
I think it's important to point out that Islam doesn't define itself as a religion. They define themselves as a complete way of life governed by law. So, and that's a key distinction. That is purposely confused in the West, because instantly, once it's just a religion, you're just Muslims among Protestants, or Muslims among Catholics, or Muslims among Jews, when in fact, and then you'll be told that you should treat Islamic law as Jewish halakha, or as canon law in the Catholic Church. But Islam makes it very clear that that is not what that is. It is the law of the land. So the question becomes, in my mind, if a Muslim wants to come to America and live in America, they can live their life here on the understanding of how the West has always defined religion. And it's always defined religion going back to Plato, in the ancient Greeks, but Christ saying you render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar. You render unto God the things that are God's. And that there has always been that understanding of a separation in the West. And by not discussing the fact that Islamic law is the law of the land, you are allowing them to step up and implant Islamic law centers, because an imam is the arbitrator of Islamic law. And so you're creating separate legal structures that are understood to be legal structures in that domain, where when an imam says if you go vote in an election it's haram and you can be put to death, that Muslim who heard that, especially an immigrant Muslim who heard that, he's not saying, gosh, maybe I should pray and think about whether I want to do this. He's hearing, we're telling you according to the law that we can hold against you, that we can bring sanctions against you if you decide to do that.
Yeah, okay, but I understand that. So basically what you're saying is, because Islam is not a religion but a way of life set by a number of laws, it kind of, in Western civilized countries, enjoys the protection of religion, which is really not. So it's using the freedom of religion and the protections that offers as a shield while invading and changing the host country.
Yes. But, yes, absolutely true. However, they are being allowed. to come in.
And that leads to my
set up the
next
shield.
question, because this is airing in Denmark primarily, so even though we speak English, we'll still have to relate to the Danish audience. But I think this is probably true of most Western European cultures, and even other cultures in the world based on descendants of Western Europe, which would be like the United States for the most part, Judeo-Christian civilization. In Denmark, we have huge amounts of Muslims that either come in and or are born by people who have come in. And there is a great clash between Danish values and those people's values. In Denmark, we tend not to hit each other when we're angry with each other. We tend to just speak with each other. Maybe say harshly, "You're wrong, you shouldn't be like that." And then we tend to say, we're not forced to have sex with anybody, but if you two want to have sex, you can do that. We don't meddle with that. We tend to say, okay, well, you're a female. That doesn't mean you're half as much worth as me because I'm a male. Maybe if you're a murderer, you're worth less, but that's not because of your sex. And also we tend to say, yeah, we may have different religions, though most of us are either atheist or culturally Christian, Lutheran, but we even though we may be very religious in some kind of Christian or Buddhist or Hindu way, we tend to say that it's Parliament that decides the supreme law of the land. And in all those points, we have the Danish values and then we have Muslim values, and they're contradictory. So why would someone bring in something that completely negates and destroys those Danish values? What purpose would they have, and who would do that?
Well, I know that it's saying something that's apocryphal, but I think because the left wants to destroy Western civilization. And the best way to do that is to bring in a population that will force you to have to give up those ideas and values, not least because when there's a conflict, who gets prosecuted? Who gets prosecuted? Is it it's famous, the New Year's raping in Europe, okay? And who got prosecuted? It was the people complaining about it, okay? Well, they certainly did not respect pluralism. They're guilty of that. They are guilty of that. They are guilty of a hate crime because they pointed out who did it. That's a hate crime. What people have to understand is that's the point of these crimes, to criminalize your right to have a right. So the first thing that has to understand is these hate crime narratives being passed by Western governments bring these people in to create a harsh conflict is to destroy your rights, to completely destroy them. Okay, and you are losing them because you're losing that fight. And at the end of the day, the whole goal of this movement from the left is to transition people from being citizens to being subjects. That's the goal. And if they have to import a whole bunch of others, meaning what I mean by others is here you are, let's find its opposite and let's bring it into direct conflict. And that's what's going on.
Yeah, so I understand that. Obviously, to destroy individual values and rights is very effective. You bring something that's completely contradictory to that, particularly with people who bring in are very violent, and you bring them in against people who are non-violent. I mean, I can understand that. So I'll have to ask you.
Well, and letting them be violent.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, they do that all over the place. I mean, you can be hit a lot by Muslims in Denmark without anything happening about it. Obviously,
yes, you could be prosecuted for complaining about
it.
it.
Absolutely. I mean, we then finally when somebody.
Well, that is the game. You see, people think this is what I have to get over to make my point. This is the point. This is the point.
Yeah.
And this goes into the whole thing of, and there's nothing following it.
No, okay. But I mean, the thing is, there was actually a case when, this is not complaining about it, but I think an Afghani teenager, he'd been very, he wasn't particularly bright, but we won't go into that. But what he was good at was his proclivity for violence. And he'd been kind of bullying some Danish boys that were a year or 2 years younger, because apparently he was in the same class because he wasn't that bright and so forth. And he'd been kind of violent and bullying towards them. And then unfortunately escalated to the point where eventually some of them met with him and they threw gasoline on him and lit it on. And is that obviously they got prosecuted. I mean, the story here wasn't they'd been bullied and hit by this person for 2 years straight. No, the story was they were committing hate crime and violence against this innocent Afghani person. Is that the kind of thing we'll see more, where we have violence because people react, and then always it's the inhabitants, the original population that's being prosecuted and hurt?
Well, I think there's three levels of answer to that question. The first level is hate crime is about punishing thought. Okay? If I think I have no problem with those boys being prosecuted for throwing gasoline on them and lighting them on fire. That's a criminal act, and it's a vicious criminal act.
Absolutely. Okay?
They should be prosecuted and go to jail. I think the hate speech narrative is about pushing people back so they'll start making irrational responses. For example, playing out how you explain this, it was probably the case that those boys complained many times.
Oh yeah.
That they were being bullied and they were being pushed around, so that they were getting desperate. Now, does that excuse what they did? It doesn't. Okay? Hate crime is about punishing people for what the state says you think. Actually, it doesn't punish you for thought. It punishes you for what the state decides you think when they decide they're going to criminalize it. But law, Western law, has always only been about punishing people for their acts. And everybody agrees in history of the West that when the West went off its standard, they prosecuted for people for when they did things, prosecute people for things other than acts. Because in a free society, you get to think what you want. Does that answer your question?
Well, it does, and it's also very relevant because I have been convicted in Denmark, not for something I said, but for something the court decided they thought I said. I said that, if you want to run a country, it's not very good if the people running the country in the ANC in South Africa have a very low IQ. If that's the case, they're not going to be able to run the country. That's not what the courts thought I said. The court said, well, that's what you say you said, but we think you said that all the black people in South Africa have an IQ of about 70, and that's very hateful and demeaning, so therefore we sentence you to a suspended jail sentence. That is what you're saying is contradictory to Western values and history in Western countries.
Well, I think you're hitting on a point that if you take one step back and then step back into it, you get you magnify that, which is hate speech is about prosecuting people for how other people choose to perceive it. So you're responsible for the response of other people, no matter how
absurd
this is. So now you have to understand that what is embedded in that is an attack on speech. Because no matter what you say, somebody can always be upset. So in the name of saying, I'm an American, and I look at the First Amendment, and then I look at Article 10 of the European
Convention on
Human Rights, on freedom of expression, and it's like, I'm sorry, it's, Article 10, Section 1 says all the stuff that kind of is like the First Amendment, but it isn't. It's not quite there. But Article 2 negates everything in. It basically says what it says. So you do not have free expression. You have privileged expression. And the state gets to decide when they're going to revoke that privilege. And hate speech is about the fact that they got to interpret what you said any way they wanted it to. The legal phrase of it is they could interpret what you said for any reason or no reason at all to read into your statement what they needed to say to silence you. And it's a direct assault on speech. And it's a direct assault on your speech. And it will always be assaulted whenever it interferes with the other being here to destroy you in your own culture. That is the game. And increasingly, to me, it becomes more important to understand that they're not here because they just wandered here. And they're not allowed to do that because they did something. They were brought in for this purpose to destroy you. How's that?
Well,
that becomes a domestic issue.
1.8% of the Danish voting population is aware of this fact, I think, safe to say. But maybe more if we count in the fraudulent ballots and so forth. But let me just ask you a final question. What is the solution? How are we Danes going to fight and win against this attempt and process of destroying us and our culture?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because we have this discussion here, And I am sometimes the one who falls into the argument that says, you know what? We have to wait for everything to break. We have to wait for people to actually have their hands burned. You know,
well, that's a Civil War narrative.
Yes.
It is, yes.
Yes,
armed conflict.
No, I am not saying, gosh, I'm pushing for a civil war.
No, I understood that, but
I'm
you're saying you're in the faction that says there is no democratic solution. That's not possible. So what will happen eventually is people will be fed up with the rapes and the murders, and they will defend themselves.
I'm not quite saying that. I'm not quite saying I'm advocating civil war. I'm saying, you know, you get to the point where people are so, the common language we use is, from the movie The Matrix. These people are living in the blue pill universe, and until someone takes a bat, hits them on the head, and breaks them, empties the vat that they're in, so they have to wake up. Okay. That then they might respond. And you know what your response would be, but Steve, that might be too late. And the answer is, that may be true. So I'm not saying that as an advocacy. I'm saying, we have seen so many things happen that 50 years, your grandparents would have said, what the F? Get the hell out of here.
Yeah.
And you're watching people respond today in a ludicrous way. So short of that, what do I think people have to do? They have to make a decision to understand. They have to be Neo in the Matrix, who understands that they can't quite get their hands on why it's wrong, but they at least have to get to understand that it's wrong. And then they have to decide that they can't wait for the information to come to them, because that's coming to them from people who want them to respond a certain way. They have to go after the information. And finally, they have to ground what they're doing in facts, not in opinions, because we're going to be brought down by people who are successfully imposing narratives that overwrite national identity.
Well, I mean, we many young people in Denmark are aware of this. That's why they don't believe their teachers anymore, because their teachers are lying to them, whereas I am speaking the truth and showing them that the truth is what the truth is, when Ali and Mohammed and Mahmoud are doing what they're doing in those ghettos. Well, Steve Coughlin, very educational. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure.